Filtering data in Power Apps doesn't always need to use dropdowns and checkboxes. In this video, I'm showing you a tag-based filter component that I built to let users filter data by visual tags. It's fully reusable, works inside of component libraries, and makes filtering intentional for your users. Let's take a look at how to build this and where to use this pattern. Channel members have access to download the apps used in the videos, as well as the YAML code used in the components that I showcase. You can click the join button below the video if you're interested in supporting the channel. We'll start by going into our components and creating a new component called tag filter. We are going to create some custom properties pretty early on, but we'll format our component first and get some of our controls on the screen. Change the component's height to 40, and then we'll insert a horizontal container called container tag filter component. We'll do a couple things to format this container, mainly setting its contents to align to the start of the container, setting the X and Y values to 0, and setting the width to parent.width and the height to parent.height. We'll change the padding on all sides to 0 and the border radius to 0 as well. We'll also remove the drop shadow from this container. Inside of our tag filter component container, we'll insert a horizontal gallery, and we'll call this gal tag filter. We'll set the gallery to align to the start of the container, and we'll set the height to parent.height. We'll disable the flexible width option, and for now we'll just keep this at 640, but we're going to come back and make this dynamic later. We are going to change our template size a little later on, but for now we'll just set this to 100 to make our development of the component a little bit easier. We'll also set the template padding to 0 as well. We don't want to show the scroll bar in the container. That should be all for the initial setup of our gallery. Inside of our gallery item, we'll go ahead and insert a button control, and we'll call this button button tag. You can see right now it's kind of hiding outside of the gallery item, so for now we'll set the X value as 0, and then for the Y value we want to center this button inside of the gallery, so we'll enter parent.template_height divided by 2 minus self.height divided by 2. And now our button will always be centered in the gallery. We'll set the padding of our button with 0 on the top and bottom, and 4 on the left and right. That may not look like it did anything initially, but I promise later that will make our text fit our button much better than it does by default. We'll scroll down a bit farther and we'll change the font size to 12. We'll create some custom properties later on that will allow us to format these using actual component properties rather than needing to change the component every time you want to make a change. That will ultimately just make the component more flexible for you. The next thing we'll do is start to define our custom properties. The first one that we need to create is a table data input called items. This will be our input property of tag items for our component. If we select our custom property for items, we can set its default value. And here we can provide it with the schema of how we want our tag filter items to appear in our component. For this input property, we'll need to provide two things. One is the text, and this is the value that would actually show up on the button. And then we also want to provide a value. The reason we do it this way is that we can separate what text is shown on the button versus what filter we actually send to our data source. So if you need to make the text of your button a little bit more friendly for the user to read, you can change that specifically in the text property, but the value that gets sent to your data source for filtering can actually be the true value there. I've just copied this a couple times so we have some buttons to look at in our component. Next, we need to set up some other properties that will change the behavior of our component depending on if they're enabled or disabled. The first custom property we'll enter is one called allow multiple selections, and this will be a data input of type Boolean. We'll leave the default value of this as true, and if this is enabled, we can allow for multiple tag filters to be selected by the user. Otherwise, if it's disabled, we only want one tag filter to be active at a time. We'll create another custom property called allow empty selection, and this will also be another input Boolean. This custom property will control whether no tag can be selected or if there must always be at least one selected. While we're creating properties, we'll create two more, one for selected and this will be a data output of type text, and then another one for selected items, and this will be a data output of type table. We'll come back to set those values later. Next, we can go to our gallery for our tag filter, and we'll replace the items property with the items from our component. We are going to have to set these items again, but for now we'll just set them here, and I'll explain why we'll change them a little bit later. Next, we can select our button, and we can go to the text property. We'll start to fill in the different values from our items of the component, like the text of the button being this item.text. If we go to the Advanced tab and we go to the onSelect property of the button, we can write our formula that will either select or remove the tag from our selected tags. The first thing we'll do here is check if this item.value is in our tag filter component's selected items property. Just for code readability and ease of understanding, we want our first condition here to be the opposite value, so we'll wrap our condition in parenthesis and enter an exclamation at the beginning. If the value is not found in our selected items, we'll go ahead and collect the value into selected items. The record in this case will have a single column called value, and we simply want to collect this item.value. If our condition above is not true, which means that the item is found inside of our selected items, then we want to remove an item from our collection, and it will be that same record of a single column called value with a value of this item.value. We'll come back and expand on this in a second, but you can see we have an error for our selected items property. We never set the default value of our selected items, and that's because we have to go and set this as our new collection that we just created. So we'll head over to our custom property for selected items, and we'll set the default value to selected items. Now we can set our default value for the selected property. So in this case, our selected items were the collection of items that we had selected, and our selected item is just going to be the first out of that selection.value. We can go back to our button, and now we can add some more logic. When we add a tag, we want to add another check here to check if we're allowed to have multiple selections in our component. If that's the case, then we'll go ahead and collect the selected item, or if that's not the case and we can only have one single selection, then we instead want to use a clear collect function to clear all the other items and only collect this item.value. Under our removal section here, we'll enter a similar check to see if we're allowed to have an empty selection, or if the count of items in our selected items collection is greater than 1. If that's the case, then we'll go ahead and remove the item from our collection. Just to recap here, we're first checking if this item.value is inside of our selected items custom property. That custom property is pointed to our collection of selected items. If this item's value is not found in that collection, meaning it's not currently selected, then we want to try to add that tag as a selection. We first check if we're allowed to have multiple selections, and if we are, we go ahead and collect this item.value. If we're only allowed to have one selection, then we instead use the clear collect function to clear all the other selections and only collect the selected one. If this item.value is found in our selected items, then our remove tag section will run. In this section, we check if we're allowed to have an empty selection or if the count of rows in our collection of selected items is greater than 1. If either of those are true, then we can go ahead and remove the tag that the user selected. Next, we'll head over to our button's type property. Here we want to indicate to the user if this button is currently selected. So we can check if this item.value is in our collection of selected items.value or that single column table. And if it is in that collection, then we want to show a primary button, or otherwise we want to show a secondary button. We can try this out by selecting one of our tags, and then if we select it again, we can see it's unselected. We can select multiple tags, and we can see those highlight appropriately. This is completely optional, but under the icon, we can also add an indicator to show that something is selected, and we can show a dismiss icon to indicate to the user that they can select the icon to unselect the tag. In the icon property, we can check if this item.value is in our collection of selected items.value, and we want to check if the count of rows inside of our collection is greater than 1, or if we're allowed to have an empty selection. If those conditions are true, then we'll show the dismiss icon. Now, if we select a button, we can see the icon shown, and users would typically see that over on the right-hand side, so we can switch that to icon after as the layout. With all of that done, we'll go back to our custom properties and add some more new ones. First, we need a way to set a default selected item or list of items, so we'll create a new property called default selected items. This will be a data input of type table. The default value of this is going to be pretty simple. It'll just be an empty table with 2 quotations, and this follows the same structure as our collection of selected items, just a single column called value. If we were filling this in the real world, we could pull this from a data source, or we could simply enter a list of items here. Since this is just the default value of the component, we'll leave it empty like this. Over on the Advanced tab, we'll go to the onReset action. And here we simply want to clear collect our collection of selected items, and we want to collect our default selected items of the component. Now, if the item's custom property of our component changes, we also want to reset the component so that it can grab the new default selected items. So we'll go ahead and raise onReset when value changes for the item's property. We'll also add some styling properties. So the first one we'll call tag fill, and this will be a data input of type color. For the default value of this, I'll simply set it to app.theme.colors.primary, but of course you could set this to a specific color once you insert this on the screen. This would just be the default value of the selected tag colors. With our custom property, we can go to our actual buttons, and we can set the base color palette as our tag filter component .tag fill. The next custom property we'll add is one called tag height. So right now these tags are pretty large, but we want to create a data input of type number. And for the default value of this, we'll simply set it to 24. Now we can set our button's height to tag filter.tag height. And this can be customized once we insert the component onto a screen. Now the one thing we have not handled yet is the actual button's width. Things will get a little bit complicated here, so just stick with me and I'll explain things as we go along. And at the end of this, you'll have buttons that automatically expand to fit the text on the button. In a typical scenario, I would set the button's width in this case to a calculation for the length of this item.text times 10.5. And you can see that resizes the buttons and kind of makes them match the text a little bit better. The problem comes in with text values that are too large for this gallery, since horizontal galleries don't have an adjustable template size. In vertical galleries, this isn't really an issue because we have the flexible height gallery, but there's no such equivalent for horizontal galleries. Now we can work around this by using a small trick that allows us to push buttons and other controls outside of the bounds of the gallery items. So if you look at our X position on our buttons here, if I set this to something like 300, you can see our buttons get pushed all the way outside of their gallery items because they're all getting pushed 300 pixels to the right. Their X coordinates are greater than the template size that we've set in the gallery. We can exploit this to create tags that auto-adjust their width, but also auto-adjust their position on the canvas so that they keep the appropriate space between each tag. I'll show you more as we walk through it. We'll go ahead and create a new custom property called Gallery Items. Now this is going to be a data output of type table. When you're using this component, you'll input your items through the items property, but then we'll do some calculations on those items and output those to our gallery using this custom property. For the default value of our gallery items, we first need to start by writing a width formula. We need to define a scope variable called scope width records. And this scope variable will do some modifications to our items property and then output a table. So to do that, we'll use the for all function. For all of the items in self.items, we'll essentially create a new set of records. We'll have the text, and that will be this record.text. We'll have the value, which will be this record.value. We'll have the width, which will be that calculation I showed you where we calculate the length of the text multiplied by 10.5. So again, this for all function will run and create essentially the same records, but now with an added width column. We'll close our scope, and now we can enter our next formula that will consume that scope variable. In this one, we'll use another for all function, and in this case, we want to use the sequence function combined with the count of records inside of our scope variable to essentially iterate over each of those records once again. The sequence function is essentially just creating a table with a single column called value, counting up from 1 up to however many records are defined in our scope variable. We'll do something very similar to the previous for all, where we're going to create a set of records. We'll have the same text record, and in this case, to get the value from our scope variable, we need to use the index function on our scope variable, and the index function just retrieves a specific record from that table. So in this case, since our sequence is counting up from 1 all the way to the number of records in our scope variable, we can use this record.value to pull in our sequence number that we're currently on, and then grab the index value from that. If we use a dot after our index function, we can see our values from the items in that scope variable, like text, value, and width. So in this case, we'll select text, and we'll just copy this entire index function because we'll use that for the next 2 lines as well. We'll create a value column, and that will be the same index function followed by dot value. We'll add the width column, which again will be the same index function, now using the width property. And then finally, we need to add a column called x. This is the x coordinate that we're going to pass to each gallery item. And this will tell that gallery item where to be pushed outside of the bounds of the gallery's template. To get this value, we need to use the sum function combined with the first n function. We want to retrieve the first n rows from our scope variable, and the number of rows we want to retrieve will be equal to our current position in our sequence minus 1. So essentially, we're finding all the records prior to this tag in our scope variable above. What we're trying to get from this are the widths of those previous items. So the value that we want to sum is the width property. Now we also need to add some padding to this between each item in the gallery, since we're no longer using the default padding that the gallery provides. So to this, we'll add a count rows function, again counting those first n records of all the records prior to this current one in the sequence, and we'll multiply that count by 4. That will provide 4 pixels of padding between each gallery item. We have our for all closed, and then we'll close our width function. This seems like a lot of code, I know, but this is all to overcome the fact that we don't have a flexible width horizontal gallery. Essentially, what this code is doing is calculating the width of each button, and then calculating for each of those what the width of all the previous buttons are, and using that value as the X property plus some padding. So essentially, we're manually positioning these buttons next to each other. Now that we've done that, we can actually go to our gallery, and we can simply switch out our data source to point to tagFilter.galleryItems. One thing to note with this is that we need to set the template size to 0, and you'll see it defaults to 1, and all of our buttons kind of got squished together there. And now we can go to our individual button and start to fill in our values. So for the X property, we simply want to set this as this item.x, and then for the width property, we want to set this as this item.width. And now you can see our buttons are perfectly spaced from each other. If I go to our items, for example, and I give our first button some more text, you can see how it expands, but it keeps the same positioning relative to the other buttons because those now see the new width of that button and calculate the appropriate X coordinate further in the chain. There is one more piece to the gallery items that we can add, and that is on the width property of our first for all, we can account for our icon being visible on the actual button. To do that, we'll enter a plus followed by an if statement, and we'll check if this record.value is in selected items and the number of items in our collection is greater than 1. Or we're allowed to have an empty selection. If that's the case, then we want to add 16 to this to account for the dismiss button. You can see the buttons slightly expand now when they're selected. You can also play around with this value of 10.5 if you want to provide more or less padding on the buttons. You can see it shrinks how much padding is on the left and right of the button. I think we just have two things left to do. Go to our buttons and just make these look a little more tag-like, so we can change the border radius to 12, and that kind of gives them a rounded appearance. Finally, we need to add an auto width function to our gallery, and then accommodate that auto width by adding a scroll bar to our container, just in case we have too many filter tags to fit inside of the width of our component. In our gallery's width property, we pretty much know the width of our gallery based on the last item in the gallery's width plus the last item in the gallery's X property, plus 4 for the extra padding. You can see our gallery sizes itself appropriately to each of our buttons. Now for our horizontal container, we can simply set the horizontal overflow to scroll. If we change the default width of our component to 200, you can see that scroll bar appears. Now the only problem here is that it's actually cutting off the bottom of our buttons. So we can accommodate this by going into our container and going to the vertical alignment. If our gallery's width is greater than the width of this container, then we want to align our items to the center. Otherwise, we can align them to the start. Now, if you do get the error that I just received for something like a circular reference, I'm not really sure where that came from, but saving and reloading the app for some reason resolved it. So if you do get the same as you're building this component, just try to save your app and reload it. Again, the reason we did that alignment trick is essentially to check if the scroll bar would be seen, or in other words, if the gallery's width is greater than this container's width, then we want the gallery to be top aligned vertically, or if there's no scroll bar, then we can align it at the start. So the end result of that here is when the scroll bar is visible, we can scroll through our tags just fine, or if we expand the width of our component, now those are centered vertically in the container. With all of that done, we now have a working component. So let's go try it out. We'll go to our screen and we'll insert our component in this container, and here we can see our buttons. Looking at our properties, we have our items, allowing multiple selections, allowing an empty selection. We have our default selected item, as well as our tag fill and our tag height. We'll leave the default settings for now, and we'll just try selecting multiple buttons. We can see that works properly, and then we can deselect those as well. We'll disable allowing multiple selections, and we'll try to select multiple here, but we can see it only allows us to select one. We'll disable allow empty selection, and now that X goes away on our single selection button because we're not allowed to deselect it. Instead, we have to have one of these selected. We'll set our default selected item as button 2, and then we can insert a button on the screen and reset our component, and we can see that automatically selected button 2 as the value. We'll insert a text control here, and we'll point that to our tag filter component. And for this, we'll point it to .selected. In this case, we can see the output value from our component based on the button that we have selected. We can insert a table control and point that to our tag filter selected items. And for the field, we'll just add this value column. If we enable multiple selections on our tag filter, we can see each of those selections represented in the table. If we allow an empty selection and we deselect that final one, there are no more selected items in the table. Now we'll look at another example. This is a SharePoint list inside of a table control, and we're simply filtering that SharePoint list by our selected tag filter. The column in this case that we're filtering by is the case status column, which is a choice column with 3 options. Now I've listed those 3 options in the items property of our tag filter as both the text and the value. We can see if I select one of the tags, now our table is filtered by that value. Now you might ask how you can tie this directly to a choice column inside of SharePoint to get the list of choices from that column. Typically what you would do in that case is use the choices function pointed to your data source, dot the name of the column. In this example, case status. We can see the result of that formula is a single column table with closed, pending, and open. These don't get reflected in our component because we do need to make one change to make this possible. If we go to our component, we can go to the gallery items and take a look at this first part of our formula. If we only want to feed a single column table, such as value, into our component, then we need to populate this text column, because if we're not passing in a table with a text column, then that value is going to be blank. So in this case, we can use the coalesce function to take the first non-blank value of either this record.text or this record.value. If the text column is blank, then it will use the value column instead. We'll copy this coalesce function and insert that in our length function. This way the width is properly calculated based on either the text value or the actual value column. If we return to our app, now we can see our options show up here, and we're only passing in the choices function. Really, that text column isn't required by any means, but it does help in situations where you need to display something different on the filter versus what you're actually sending to the back end. In this case, the filters still work the same. They're sending back the value column to filter that SharePoint list by the case status value. If we were using a data source that could delegate multiple items in a choice column, we would change this to reference case status.value is in tag filter.selected items. If we enable multiple selections on our tag filter component, now we can filter by each of these and it will show filter results. In SharePoint, in this case, this isn't delegable, but you could delegate this in a data source like Dataverse. We'll test the default selected item here by setting that to open, and then we'll insert a button here that will reset our tag filter, and we can see that automatically selects open as the selected value. We could try setting the default selected items as all three of those, and again, if we reset, now we can see all three of those are selected. And that's about it. Let me know your thoughts on this tag filter component, and if you think you'll use it in any of your apps. If you have any questions about this component, let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, give it a like and get subscribed for future videos like this one. I hope you enjoyed, and have a great day.